The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the royal palace as Ambassador Richard Morrison adjusted his tie for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cool autumn air, but from the weight of responsibility that pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. After 20 years in diplomatic service, he had never felt more unprepared for a single meeting. Richard had arrived in the Kingdom of Eldoria just 6 weeks ago, replacing Ambassador Collins, who had suffered a sudden heart attack. The transition had been rushed, incomplete, and now Richard found himself facing the most important diplomatic crisis of his career with barely enough knowledge to navigate the complex royal protocols that governed every interaction within these ancient walls. The crisis itself was simple enough to understand but devastating in its implications. 3 months ago, a trade dispute had erupted between Eldoria and Richard's home country of Valencia. What started as a disagreement over textile tariffs had escalated into accusations of industrial espionage, frozen assets, and, now, the threat of complete economic sanctions. King Alexander III had summoned Richard for what the royal secretary had ominously called final discussions. As Richard climbed the palace steps, he noticed the increased security presence. Royal guards stood at attention every few meters, their ceremonial uniforms somehow making them appear more intimidating rather than decorative. These weren't just ceremonial positions, Richard reminded himself. The Royal Guard of Eldoria was an elite military unit with a history stretching back 4 centuries. Each guard was selected not only for their physical prowess but for their unwavering loyalty to the crown and their absolute adherence to royal protocol. Captain Elena Vasquez stood at the main entrance, her dark hair pulled back in a perfect military bun, her uniform immaculate despite having been on duty since dawn. At 28, she was the youngest person ever to achieve the rank of captain in the Royal Guard, a promotion that had come after she single-handedly prevented an assassination attempt on the Queen 2 years earlier. Her colleagues respected her tactical brilliance, but what truly set her apart was her encyclopedic knowledge of royal protocol and her ability to read situations before they escalated. Elena watched Ambassador Morrison approach with the trained eye of someone who had spent years protecting the royal family. She noticed his nervous energy, the way his eyes darted around as if looking for threats that didn't exist, and, most telling of all, the slight disrespect in his posture. He carried himself like a man who believed his diplomatic status placed him above the rules that governed everyone else in the kingdom. Richard had been briefed about Captain Vasquez, though the briefing had been minimal. His predecessor's notes mentioned her as efficient but rigid and warned about her inflexible adherence to protocol. What the notes had failed to capture was the intelligence that burned behind her dark eyes or the way she seemed to anticipate problems before they occurred. As Richard approached, he made his first mistake of many that day. "Captain," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that would have been perfectly normal in any other setting. "I'm Ambassador Morrison. I believe we haven't been properly introduced." Elena looked at his extended hand but didn't move to shake it. In Eldorian royal protocol, physical contact between foreign officials and royal guard officers was strictly forbidden unless specifically authorized by the monarch. The rule existed not out of arrogance but from centuries of experience with assassination attempts and security breaches. "Your Excellency," Elena replied, her voice perfectly controlled and professional. "I am Captain Vasquez. I will be escorting you to the throne room where His Majesty awaits." The slight rebuff of his handshake attempt irritated Richard more than it should have. Back home in Valencia, such formality was seen as unnecessary and even rude. He had grown up in a political culture that valued directness and casual interaction, even in formal settings. The rigid protocol of Eldoria struck him as antiquated posturing. "Of course," Richard said, lowering his hand but allowing a note of displeasure to creep into his voice. "Though I have to say, your protocols here seem rather excessive. In Valencia, we've found that a little human warmth goes a long way in diplomatic relations." Elena's expression didn't change, but, behind her calm facade, she was already cataloging this interaction as a potential problem. Foreign dignitaries who dismissed Eldorian protocol as excessive usually created difficulties before their visits were over. She had seen it countless times. Outsiders who assumed that their own cultural norms should take precedence over 4 centuries of carefully developed royal tradition. "This way, Your Excellency," Elena said, gesturing toward the main corridor. As they walked, she maintained the precise distance required by protocol, exactly 2 steps behind and 1 step to the left of the ambassador. This positioning allowed her to observe his behavior while remaining ready to intervene if necessary. The palace corridors were magnificent, lined with portraits of former monarchs and decorated with priceless artifacts from Eldoria's rich history. Normally, Elena enjoyed these walks through the palace, finding peace in the continuity they represented. Today, however, she found herself increasingly concerned about Ambassador Morrison's behavior. Richard seemed unable to appreciate the historical significance of his surroundings. Instead of showing the respectful attention that protocol demanded, he appeared impatient, checking his watch multiple times and sighing audibly when they stopped at security checkpoints. At one point, he pulled out his phone to check messages, completely ignoring Elena's polite explanation of a famous tapestry they were passing. "Ambassador," Elena said carefully, "I should mention that electronic devices must be turned off before entering the throne room. It's a security protocol that applies to all visitors." Richard looked up from his phone with barely concealed irritation. "Security protocol? Captain, I'm a senior diplomatic representative, not a tourist. I think we can make exceptions for people at my level." The presumption in his voice sent a warning signal through Elena's mind. She had dealt with entitled foreign officials before, but something about Ambassador Morrison's attitude suggested that this encounter might escalate beyond the usual diplomatic tensions. She chose her words carefully, maintaining the respectful tone required when addressing a foreign dignitary while making the kingdom's position absolutely clear. "Your Excellency, the protocols apply to all visitors without exception. This includes heads of state, royalty from other nations, and all diplomatic personnel. The rules exist for everyone's safety and have never been waived." Richard's face flushed slightly at what he perceived as a lecture from someone he considered a mere security guard. In Valencia, ambassadors were treated with enormous deference, and the idea that a guard captain would speak to him in such a manner was both shocking and infuriating. He had assumed that his diplomatic credentials would grant him special privileges, especially given the delicate nature of his mission. "Captain Vasquez," he said, his voice taking on an edge that Elena immediately recognized as dangerous. "I think you may be confused about the relative importance of diplomatic immunity versus your local customs. I'm here representing my government in a matter of critical importance to both our nations." Elena stopped walking and turned to face the ambassador directly. Years of training had taught her to recognize the signs of an escalating situation, and every instinct she possessed was now screaming warnings. Ambassador Morrison's body language had shifted from merely impatient to openly aggressive. His shoulders had straightened, his voice had risen slightly, and, most concerning of all, he was positioning himself as if preparing for a confrontation. "Your Excellency," Elena said, her voice remaining calm despite the tension she felt building, "I understand the importance of your mission. However, diplomatic immunity does not supersede security protocols within the royal palace. These rules have been in place for centuries and have prevented numerous security incidents." The mention of numerous security incidents was perhaps not the most diplomatic way to phrase it, but Elena believed in being direct about security matters. She had studied every major breach in palace security over the past century, and almost all of them had begun with someone believing they were important enough to ignore established protocols. Richard's patience, already strained by weeks of cultural adjustment and the pressure of his failing mission, finally snapped. The combination of jet lag, stress, and what he perceived as disrespect from someone he considered beneath his station created a perfect storm of poor judgment. Without thinking about the consequences, he took a step closer to Elena and raised his voice. "Listen to me very carefully, Captain. I don't have time for this bureaucratic nonsense. I am here on urgent government business, and I will not be lectated by a security guard about rules that clearly weren't designed with people of my rank in mind." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with a potential security threat. But this wasn't a physical threat that she could neutralize with force. This was something far more dangerous, a complete breakdown in diplomatic protocol that could have far-reaching consequences for both nations. Around them, other royal guards had begun to take notice. Though they maintained their positions and continued their duties, Elena could sense their heightened attention. any unusual interaction involving a foreign diplomat was automatically considered a potential security incident, and Richard's raised voice had definitely qualified as unusual. Elena took a deep breath and made a decision that would define not only the rest of this encounter but potentially the entire diplomatic relationship between their two nations. She could choose to de-escalate, to find some face-saving compromise that would allow Ambassador Morrison to save face while maintaining protocol. Or she could stand firm on the principles that had guided the Royal Guard for 4 centuries, regardless of the diplomatic consequences. "Your Excellency," she said, her voice now carrying the full authority of her position, "I am not a security guard. I am a captain in the Royal Guard of Eldoria, sworn to protect this palace and everyone in it, including you. The protocols I've described are not suggestions or bureaucratic obstacles. They are absolute requirements that apply to every person who enters this building." The steel in her voice surprised Richard. He had expected compliance, perhaps even deference, from someone he saw as merely following orders. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who spoke with the quiet confidence of absolute authority. For the first time since arriving in Eldoria, Richard began to understand that he might have seriously misjudged the situation. The tension in the corridor had reached a breaking point, and Richard Morrison found himself in completely uncharted territory. Throughout his diplomatic career, he had navigated complex negotiations, handled delicate cultural situations, and managed international crises. But none of his experience had prepared him for this moment, standing face to face with a Royal Guard captain who refused to bend to his authority. Elena Vasquez maintained her composed stance, but, internally, she was running through every possible scenario. Her training had covered diplomatic incidents extensively, but most of those scenarios assumed that foreign officials would eventually recognize the wisdom of following protocol. Ambassador Morrison showed no signs of backing down, and his increasingly aggressive posture suggested that he was about to make an even bigger mistake. "Captain Vasquez," Richard said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his diplomatic authority, "I'm going to make this very simple. I'm ordering you to escort me directly to the king. No more delays, no more protocol lectures, no more excuses. I have the full backing of my government, and I guarantee you that your superiors will not appreciate any unnecessary obstacles to this meeting." The word ordering hit Elena like a physical blow. In 28 years of life and 10 years of service in the Royal Guard, no one had ever attempted to give her orders except for her direct superior officers and the royal family itself. The presumption that a foreign diplomat could command a captain of the Royal Guard was so far beyond acceptable behavior that it took her a moment to fully process what had just happened. Around them, the atmosphere in the palace corridor shifted dramatically. The other royal guards, who had been maintaining their professional distance while monitoring the situation, now moved slightly closer. Not enough to appear threatening, but enough to signal that they were ready to intervene if necessary. Protocol demanded that they support their captain in any dispute, especially one involving a breach of royal security procedures. Sergeant James Mitchell, a 15-year veteran of the Royal Guard who was stationed near the throne room entrance, caught Elena's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The gesture communicated volumes in the silent language that all Royal Guards learned during their training. He was asking if she needed backup, and simultaneously letting her know that he had already alerted the Palace Security Command Center about the developing situation. Elena made a decision that would later be studied in diplomatic training programs across multiple continents. Instead of escalating the confrontation or attempting to de-escalate through compromise, she chose to educate. Ambassador Morrison clearly had no understanding of what he had just attempted, and perhaps if she could help him understand the magnitude of his mistake, they could still salvage the situation. "Ambassador Morrison," she said, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing a student who had made a serious error, "I need to explain something to you that apparently wasn't covered in your briefing materials. The Royal Guard of Eldoria does not take orders from foreign governments or their representatives. We serve the Crown of Eldoria exclusively, and our chain of command runs directly from His Majesty through the Guard Commander to each individual officer." Richard's face flushed deeper red as he realized that his attempt to assert authority had not only failed but had apparently been interpreted as some kind of fundamental breach of protocol. The rational part of his mind recognized that he was in dangerous territory, but his pride and frustration overrode his diplomatic training. "Captain, you're being deliberately obstructionist. I understand you have your procedures, but surely you must realize that some situations require flexibility. The trade crisis between our nations affects thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in commerce. Every minute of delay potentially makes the situation worse. Elena nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his argument. You're absolutely right about the importance of your mission, Your Excellency. The trade situation is indeed critical, and that's precisely why it's so important that we follow proper protocols. When stakes are this high, any procedural mistakes could be interpreted as disrespect or hostility. For a moment, Richard thought he had made progress. Elena's acknowledgement of his mission's importance seemed like the first step toward compromise. He prepared to press his advantage, not realizing that he had completely misunderstood her response. Exactly, he said, allowing satisfaction to creep into his voice. So let's dispense with the unnecessary formalities and focus on what really matters. I'm sure the king will appreciate efficiency over rigid adherence to outdated customs. The words outdated customs landed like a thunderclap in the ears of every royal guard within hearing distance. Elena felt her jaw tighten involuntarily as she processed the full implications of what Ambassador Morrison had just said. He had not only dismissed centuries of Eldorian tradition as outdated but had suggested that the king himself would prefer to ignore the protocols that formed the foundation of royal authority. Ambassador, Elena said, and now her voice carried a note of warning that any experienced diplomat should have recognized immediately, the protocols of this palace are not customs or formalities. They are the living embodiment of Eldorian sovereignty. When you suggest that they should be dispensed with, you are essentially arguing that Eldorian law should be subordinated to your convenience. Richard finally began to understand that he had wandered into a minefield, but his response showed that he still didn't grasp the full scope of his mistake. Captain, I think you're taking this a bit too seriously. I'm not questioning your sovereignty. I'm simply asking for reasonable accommodation of diplomatic necessity. Elena looked at him with something approaching pity. Your Excellency, let me ask you a question. If I were to visit your embassy in Valencia and demand that you ignore your security procedures because I found them inconvenient, how would that request be received? The analogy hit Richard like a bucket of cold water. For the first time since the conversation began, he tried to imagine how he would react if a foreign military officer walked into his embassy and started making demands about how things should be done. The mental image was so absurd that he almost laughed, but then, the full implications of Elena's comparison sank in. That's different, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Embassy security is a matter of national security. And palace security isn't? Elena asked quietly. Ambassador, you seem to be operating under the assumption that diplomatic protocol exists separately from security protocol. In reality, they are the same thing. Every rule, every procedure, every seemingly minor requirement exists because someone, at some point, tried to exploit exactly the kind of exception you're requesting. Richard felt his carefully constructed argument crumbling around him, but pride prevented him from backing down gracefully. Instead, he made what would later be remembered as one of the most diplomatically disastrous statements in modern international relations. Captain Vasquez, I'm afraid you're not qualified to make decisions about diplomatic protocol. I'm going to need to speak with someone who has the authority to override these restrictions. Please contact your supervisor immediately and inform them that Ambassador Morrison requires immediate accommodation. The silence that followed this statement was so complete that Richard could hear his own heartbeat. Around the corridor, royal guards who had been maintaining professional positions while monitoring the situation now stood perfectly still, as if frozen by the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Elena herself seemed momentarily speechless, not from confusion or intimidation, but from sheer amazement at the depth of Ambassador Morrison's misunderstanding. Sergeant Mitchell, who had been observing from his position near the throne room, later described the moment as watching someone demand that gravity be temporarily suspended for their convenience. The comparison was more apt than he realized, because what Ambassador Morrison had just done was attempt to suspend the fundamental laws that governed how the Eldorian royal palace operated. Elena took a deep breath and made a decision that would echo through diplomatic circles for years to come. She activated the discreet communication device that all Royal Guard captains carried, sending a coded signal that immediately alerted the guard commander, the palace security center, and the royal private secretary's office that a Category 3 diplomatic incident was in progress. "Ambassador Morrison," she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her authority and position, "you have just requested that I violate my oath of service to accommodate your convenience. You have dismissed the sovereignty of Eldoria as outdated customs. You have attempted to command a royal guard officer as if you were her superior. And now you have suggested that I am not qualified to perform the duties for which I have been specifically trained and appointed by His Majesty himself." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Elena held up a hand to stop him. "Your Excellency, I am going to give you one opportunity to reconsider your approach. In 30 seconds, my commanding officer will arrive to assess this situation. When he does, you will have a choice. You can acknowledge that you may have misunderstood our protocols and allow me to properly escort you to your meeting with His Majesty. Or you can continue to insist that your diplomatic status grants you authority over Eldorian royal guards." The corridor had become completely silent except for the distant sound of footsteps approaching rapidly. Richard could hear at least 3 sets of heavy boots moving toward them with military precision, and he realized with growing dread that his situation was about to become significantly more complicated. "What happens if I choose the second option?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Elena's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to grow colder. "Then, Your Excellency, you will learn exactly what it means to challenge the authority of the Royal Guard of Eldoria in their own palace." Commander William Sterling had served in the Royal Guard for 32 years, rising through every rank from private to the highest position in the palace security hierarchy. In those 3 decades, he had protected 3 different monarchs, prevented 14 assassination attempts, and managed countless diplomatic crises. But, as he strode down the marble corridor toward the unfolding confrontation between Captain Vasquez and Ambassador Morrison, he carried with him a sense of profound disappointment that had nothing to do with professional duty. Sterling had personally recommended Elena Vasquez for promotion to captain, not just because of her tactical brilliance or her courage during the Queen's assassination attempt, but because of her exceptional diplomatic skills. Elena had always been able to defuse tense situations before they escalated, finding ways to maintain security protocols while preserving the dignity of visiting dignitaries. If she had activated a Category 3 alert, it meant that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Behind Commander Sterling walked Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Burke from the Palace Diplomatic Corps and Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the Guard's senior protocol specialist. This wasn't just a security response, it was a full diplomatic intervention team. The fact that such a team was being deployed for a routine diplomatic escort told Richard Morrison everything he needed to know about how seriously his behavior was being taken. Elena maintained her position as the senior officers approached, but Richard could see the subtle change in her posture. She was no longer dealing with a difficult foreign dignitary as an individual guard officer, she was now part of a military unit responding to a potential threat to palace security. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, and it sent a chill down Richard's spine. "Captain Vasquez," Commander Sterling said as he arrived, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Report." Elena's response was precise, professional, and devastating in its clarity. "Sir, Ambassador Morrison has refused to comply with standard security protocols. He has attempted to command me to ignore established procedures, has dismissed Eldorian royal protocol as outdated customs, and has demanded that I contact my superiors to override security restrictions because he believes I lack the authority to enforce them." Commander Sterling listened to Elena's report without any change in expression, but Richard noticed that the commander's eyes never left his face. It was the look of a professional security officer assessing a potential threat, and Richard realized with growing alarm that he was being evaluated not as a diplomatic guest but as a possible security risk. "Ambassador Morrison," Commander Sterling said, his tone perfectly polite but carrying an undertone that made Richard's stomach clench, "I am Commander Sterling, head of palace security. Captain Vasquez has briefed me on your concerns regarding our protocols. Perhaps you could explain to me exactly what accommodations you believe are necessary?" The question seemed reasonable, even helpful, but Richard had spent enough years in diplomatic circles to recognize a trap when he heard one. Commander Sterling wasn't asking because he was prepared to make accommodations, he was asking because he wanted Richard to repeat his demands in front of witnesses, creating an official record of the incident. Commander Sterling, Richard said, trying to inject as much diplomatic authority into his voice as possible, I appreciate Captain Vasquez's dedication to her duties, but I think there may have been some misunderstanding about my status here. I'm not just any foreign visitor. I'm a senior diplomatic representative here on urgent government business. Surely your protocols include provisions for expedited handling of high-priority diplomatic missions. It was a reasonable attempt to reframe the situation, and, under normal circumstances, it might have worked. But Richard had already crossed too many lines, and Commander Sterling had read Elena's preliminary incident report before arriving. He knew exactly what kind of misunderstanding they were dealing with. Your Excellency, Commander Sterling replied, our protocols do indeed include provisions for high-priority diplomatic situations. Captain Vasquez has been following those provisions exactly. The expedited process involves a senior officer escort, direct routing to the throne room, and immediate scheduling with His Majesty's private secretary. That is precisely what was happening before the current difficulties arose. Richard felt the walls closing in around him as he realized that there had been no delay, no obstruction, no unnecessary bureaucracy. Captain Vasquez had been following emergency diplomatic protocols from the beginning, and his complaints had been based on a complete misunderstanding of the situation. I wasn't aware that expedited protocols were already in place, Richard admitted, though he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge the full scope of his mistake. Lieutenant Colonel Burke stepped forward, his diplomatic uniform marking him as someone who understood both military protocol and international relations. Ambassador Morrison, perhaps I can clarify the situation. When Captain Vasquez requested that you turn off your electronic device, she was following a security protocol that applies to all visitors, including foreign heads of state. When she declined to shake your hand, she was following a protocol designed to prevent any possibility of concealed weapons or surveillance devices being passed during physical contact. Each explanation hit Richard like a physical blow as he realized how completely he had misinterpreted every interaction. What he had seen as disrespect and obstruction had actually been careful adherence to protocols designed to protect him as much as everyone else in the palace. Furthermore, Lieutenant Colonel Burke continued, when you expressed concern about delays, Captain Vasquez responded by explaining the security rationale behind each procedure, which is exactly what our diplomatic guidelines recommend. At no point did she refuse your requests or create unnecessary obstacles. Richard wanted to defend himself, to explain that his behavior had been based on stress and misunderstanding, but he was beginning to realize that explanations might only make things worse. Every attempt to justify his actions seemed to reveal new layers of ignorance about Eldorian protocol and royal customs. Commander Sterling watched Richard's face as the full weight of the situation sank in. Ambassador Morrison, I need to ask you directly, do you understand that Captain Vasquez has been acting entirely within her authority and following established protocols throughout this encounter? The question hung in the air like a sword, because Richard understood that his answer would determine how the rest of this incident unfolded. If he continued to maintain that Elena had been wrong, he would be essentially arguing that the entire Royal Guard structure was incompetent. If he admitted that she had been right, he would be acknowledging that his own behavior had been completely inappropriate. Yes, I can see that Captain Vasquez has been following her procedures, Richard said carefully. But surely you can understand my frustration. The trade crisis between our nations is reaching a critical point, and every hour of delay potentially costs both countries millions of dollars. Elena spoke for the first time since Commander Sterling's arrival. Your Excellency, perhaps I failed to communicate clearly. There have been no delays. From the moment you arrived at the palace entrance until now, you have been moving through our emergency diplomatic protocol system. Under normal circumstances, a visiting ambassador would wait 3 to 5 days for an audience with His Majesty. Your meeting was scheduled for this morning specifically because of the critical nature of your mission. The revelation that he had been receiving emergency treatment all along, rather than being subjected to unnecessary bureaucracy, left Richard speechless. He had spent the entire encounter complaining about delays that didn't exist and demanding special treatment that had already been granted. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, now stepped forward with a tablet containing what appeared to be an official document. Ambassador Morrison, this is the diplomatic protocol briefing that was sent to your embassy 6 weeks ago when your predecessor's departure was announced. It details the emergency procedures that would be in place for your arrival. Richard stared at the document, recognizing the official seal of his own embassy. The briefing was comprehensive, detailing exactly the procedures that Elena had been following, explaining the security rationale behind each requirement, and even including cultural context for why certain protocols existed. I never received this briefing, Richard said weakly. According to our records, Master Sergeant Rodriguez replied, it was sent to your personal diplomatic email address, your embassy's official channels, and your advanced security team. We also have confirmation that it was reviewed and acknowledged by your deputy chief of mission. The implications were staggering. Not only had Richard been provided with all the information he needed to navigate this encounter successfully, but his own staff had confirmed receipt of that information. His behavior hadn't been the result of inadequate preparation by the Eldorians, it had been the result of his own failure to properly prepare for his assignment. Commander Sterling made a decision that would later be studied in diplomatic crisis management courses. Rather than pursuing the security implications of Richard's behavior, he chose to focus on finding a path forward that might still salvage the diplomatic mission. Ambassador Morrison, he said, I believe we have a choice to make. We can continue to analyze what went wrong in this encounter, or we can focus on ensuring that your meeting with His Majesty proceeds successfully. Captain Vasquez has indicated that she is prepared to continue your escort to the throne room if you are ready to proceed under proper protocols. It was a lifeline, an opportunity for Richard to save face and complete his mission despite the disaster of the morning. But it came with an unspoken requirement: he would need to publicly acknowledge that Elena Vasquez had been right and he had been wrong. Richard looked around the corridor at the assembled officers, all of whom were waiting for his response. Elena Vasquez stood at attention, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes holding a glimmer of what might have been sympathy. Despite everything that had happened, despite his attacks on her competence and authority, she was still prepared to help him succeed in his mission. Captain Vasquez, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, I owe you an apology. I completely misunderstood the situation, and I spoke to you in a way that was both inappropriate and unfair. Elena inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. Your Excellency, diplomatic missions are always stressful, and cultural differences can create unexpected challenges. If you are ready, I would be honored to complete your escort to His Majesty. But, as they prepared to resume their journey to the throne room, none of them could have anticipated that word of the confrontation had already reached the highest levels of the palace hierarchy, and that King Alexander III himself had been monitoring the situation with growing interest. King Alexander III of Eldoria had been monitoring the diplomatic crisis unfolding in his palace corridor through the discreet security feeds that allowed him to observe all areas of the royal residence. What he had witnessed over the past 20 minutes had confirmed his worst fears about the deteriorating relationship with Valencia while simultaneously showcasing the exceptional professionalism of his royal guard. The king was 58 years old, with the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. He had ruled Eldoria for 23 years, navigating everything from economic recessions to international conflicts, but the current trade crisis with Valencia represented one of the most serious threats to his kingdom's prosperity in decades. He had hoped that Ambassador Morrison might bring fresh perspective to the negotiations, but what he had observed suggested something far more troubling. As Elena Vasquez led the now subdued Ambassador Morrison toward the throne room, King Alexander made an unprecedented decision. Instead of waiting in the formal throne room for the ambassador's arrival, he walked to the blue reception chamber, a smaller, more intimate room typically used for private diplomatic conversations. Then, he did something that hadn't happened in the palace in over a century: he personally greeted a foreign ambassador outside the throne room. Elena was the first to see His Majesty approaching, and her military training took over instantly. She dropped to one knee in the traditional royal guard salute, her hand moving to her sword hilt in the gesture of absolute loyalty that had been unchanged for 400 years. Behind her, Commander Sterling and the other officers followed suit, creating a scene of profound respect that left Richard Morrison standing alone and uncertain. Your Majesty, Richard said, executing what he hoped was an appropriate bow. His diplomatic training had covered royal protocols, but he had never actually met a ruling monarch, and the weight of the moment left him feeling profoundly unprepared. King Alexander's first words would be remembered and analyzed by diplomatic historians for decades to come. Ambassador Morrison, I owe you an apology. The statement was so unexpected that Richard actually stepped backward in surprise. Kings did not apologize to foreign ambassadors, especially not ambassadors whose governments were engaged in serious trade disputes with their kingdoms. The protocol breach was so fundamental that Elena Vasquez looked up from her salute with barely concealed amazement. Your Majesty? Richard managed to say. Captain Vasquez, please rise, the king said, and Elena smoothly returned to attention. Ambassador Morrison, I have been observing your interaction with my staff, and I realize that we have failed you badly in our preparation for this visit. Richard's confusion was complete. After the disaster of the morning, he had expected anger, dismissal, or at best cold formality. The king's apparent acceptance of responsibility for the incident made no sense given what had actually happened. King Alexander continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. It has become clear to me that your embassy staff failed to provide you with adequate briefing materials about our protocols and procedures. No ambassador should arrive at a foreign palace without proper preparation, and the fact that this happened suggests a serious breakdown in communication. The king's words created a diplomatic masterpiece, simultaneously acknowledging the morning's problems while avoiding any direct criticism of Ambassador Morrison's behavior. By framing the incident as a failure of preparation rather than a failure of conduct, King Alexander was offering Richard a way to save face while moving forward with the critical negotiations. Elena watched the exchange with growing admiration for her monarch's diplomatic skills. In a few sentences, King Alexander had transformed a potential international incident into an opportunity for renewed cooperation. The approach was quintessentially Eldorian, respectful, graceful, and focused on solutions rather than blame. Your Majesty is very kind, Richard replied, beginning to understand the gift he was being offered. I must admit that I was inadequately prepared for the sophistication and importance of your protocols. Captain Vasquez has shown remarkable patience in helping me understand the proper procedures. King Alexander turned to Elena with a smile that filled her with pride. Captain Vasquez represents the finest traditions of our royal guard. Her ability to maintain security protocols while preserving diplomatic relationships is exactly why she holds the rank she does at such a young age. The praise was subtle but unmistakable. King Alexander was publicly acknowledging that Elena had handled a difficult situation perfectly, while also sending a message about the level of respect that Royal Guard officers commanded in Eldoria. For Richard, it was a final lesson in the cultural dynamics he had so badly misunderstood. Captain, the king continued, I believe Ambassador Morrison and I have much to discuss about the trade situation between our nations. Would you be so kind as to ensure that we have complete privacy for our conversation? It was a dismissal, but delivered with such grace and respect that Elena felt honored rather than excluded. Of course, Your Majesty. I will personally ensure that your meeting proceeds without any interruptions. As Elena and the other officers withdrew to establish a security perimeter around the blue reception chamber, King Alexander led Ambassador Morrison into the room that would host one of the most important diplomatic conversations in recent Eldorian history. Ambassador, the king said once they were alone, I want you to know that Captain Vasquez's conduct this morning will be noted in her permanent service record as an exemplary display of professionalism under difficult circumstances. Richard nodded, understanding that this was both praise for Elena and a subtle reminder that the morning's events would not be forgotten. Your Majesty, Captain Vasquez is a credit to your kingdom. I hope my behavior didn't create any lasting difficulties. King Alexander poured 2 cups of tea from an ancient service that had been used for diplomatic meetings for over 2 centuries. Ambassador, may I speak frankly about the situation between our nations? Of course, Your Majesty. The trade crisis we're facing isn't really about tariffs or industrial regulations. It's about trust. Both of our governments have allowed mistrust and miscommunication to escalate a simple commercial disagreement into a threat to the prosperity of both our peoples. Richard accepted the cup of tea, noting that the king was serving him personally rather than having servants handle the task. The gesture was loaded with symbolic meaning. This was a conversation between equals, despite the formal disparity in their ranks. This morning, King Alexander continued, you experienced firsthand how quickly misunderstanding can escalate into conflict when people operate from different assumptions and cultural frameworks. You assumed that our protocols were obstacles to be overcome. Captain Vasquez assumed that your requests represented a potential security threat. Neither of you was wrong within your own cultural context, but together you created a situation that could have become a serious incident. The parallel between the morning's encounter and the larger trade crisis was so clear that Richard felt a moment of genuine enlightenment. Your Majesty, are you suggesting that our governments have been making similar mistakes on a larger scale? Ambassador Morrison, I believe that both our nations have been so focused on protecting our own interests that we've forgotten to consider how our actions appear from the other's perspective. The result has been escalating mistrust that threatens to destroy a trading relationship that benefits millions of people in both countries. Over the next 3 hours, King Alexander and Ambassador Morrison engaged in the most productive diplomatic conversation either had experienced in months. Using the morning's incident as a framework, they analyzed each point of conflict in the trade crisis, identifying where cultural misunderstandings had amplified economic disagreements. The breakthrough came when Richard realized that Valencia's aggressive negotiating style, which was seen as direct and honest in his own culture, was being interpreted by Eldorian negotiators as disrespectful and threatening. Similarly, Eldoria's emphasis on formal protocols and careful consideration was being seen by Valencian negotiators as stalling and bureaucratic obstruction. Your Majesty, Richard said as the afternoon wore on, I think we've been conducting these negotiations as if we were two completely different species trying to communicate across an unbridgeable gap. But this morning showed me that with patience and good faith, even the most serious misunderstandings can be resolved. King Alexander smiled, remembering his own observations of Elena's handling of the crisis. Ambassador, Captain Vasquez could have easily escalated this morning's situation into a serious security incident. Instead, she chose to educate rather than retaliate, to explain rather than simply enforce. I believe our nations need to adopt the same approach to our trade discussions. As the sun began to set outside the palace windows, Richard Morrison and King Alexander III reached an agreement that would later be hailed as a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise. The trade restrictions would be gradually lifted over 6 months, with both nations committing to regular cultural exchange programs designed to prevent future misunderstandings. But, perhaps the most significant outcome of the day was personal rather than political. Ambassador Morrison had learned a profound lesson about the importance of cultural humility and proper preparation. King Alexander had been reminded that even the most serious international crises often stemmed from simple human failures in communication and understanding. As Richard prepared to leave the palace that evening, he sought out Captain Elena Vasquez to offer a final apology and expression of gratitude. He found her in the guard's administrative office, completing her incident report with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her behavior throughout the day. Captain Vasquez, he said, I wanted to thank you personally for your professionalism today. You had every right to treat me as a security threat after the way I behaved, but instead you chose to help me understand my mistakes. That choice may have saved the relationship between our countries. Elena stood and offered Richard the respectful nod that protocol required. Your Excellency, diplomatic service requires all of us to remember that we represent more than just ourselves. Today was difficult, but it ended with understanding and cooperation. That's what we all hope for in our work. As Richard left the palace and climbed into his diplomatic vehicle, he carried with him a new understanding of what true diplomatic skill looked like. It wasn't about asserting authority or demanding special treatment. It was about building bridges of understanding across cultural divides, exactly as Elena Vasquez had done when she chose education over confrontation. The story of the foreign officer who tried to command a royal guard became legendary in diplomatic circles, not as a tale of cultural conflict, but as an example of how patient professionalism could transform potential disasters into opportunities for understanding. Elena Vasquez received a commendation from the king and eventually became the youngest commander in Royal Guard history. Ambassador Morrison went on to have a distinguished career, but he never forgot the lesson learned in an Eldorian palace corridor, that true strength lay not in demanding respect, but in earning it through humility, preparation, and genuine respect for others. The trade agreement negotiated that day lasted for decades, serving as a foundation for prosperity in both nations and a testament to the power of choosing understanding over conflict.